Hey there everybody, Steve the Amateur Historian. How are you doing today or tonight, depending on what time it is for you right now? Usually when kind of, at least local, like Oregon-based unsolved cases are finally solved, especially John or Jane Doe cases, I'm usually pretty quick to make a video. I'll stumble onto it real quick, but I gotta say I missed this by a month, and I only found this because I was watching another YouTube video about some recent solved cases, and I was only watching this video haphazardly before I realized, oh, this is actually a Jane Doe victim that was from Oregon. When they finally identified the skull, the woman that was found on Mount Hood, I reported on that real quick. When they identified the infant child that had been abandoned in southern Oregon back in the early 1960s, I was pretty quick on that as well, but this one got right past me. And I noticed most of the articles on this matter were posted around April 19th, April 20th, so I'm guessing sometime in April, this mystery, 30-year-old mystery, was finally solved. So I have to admit I'm a little late on it, but if I missed it, you know, a lot of people probably don't even know about this unless you're following the news regularly or you're watching the right channel or reading the right information at the right time. But a woman by the name of Patricia Skiple was identified, or rather, remains of a dead woman that were found back in 1992 were officially identified as her. Her body was found along a highway, Highway 152 near Santa Clara. I think it was Gilroy, California is where they said the body was found. And interestingly enough, this is what got my attention, because I had this other YouTube video on in the background while I was, you know, working on stuff. I just, you know, have stuff on in the background sometimes. And they started talking about this case, and I'm kind of sort of listening, and then I see Keith Jesperson's face appear on the screen, and immediately I look up because that's a local serial killer. And the Keith, I don't want to get too much into that. But yeah, the Keith Jesperson case is actually a lot more interesting than I thought it was. I really didn't know a lot about it. But he was a guy who, at least between 1990 and 1995, was out there killing women. And I think he's known to have killed at least like 8. But as we often know in the case of serial killers, especially ones that have been allowed to roam and have been doing it over the course of multiple years, usually the number that we know for certain is not all of the victims. But I watched a like 2-parter in a Netflix series about it, and I didn't even realize that early on what really brought at least one of his victims to prominence, that then drew him out and brought the other victims he'd had to prominence, was there was, and I can't remember their names. God, the woman's name is right on the tip of my tongue, but there was this older woman who was dating, she was like around 60 and the guy was around 40, and the guy had recently got out of prison and apparently they got together by whatever means, and he wasn't treating her really well. And when one of these victims that turned out to be one of Keith Jesperson's victims came up, she told authorities that she thought maybe this guy she was with was the guilty party. And so they checked it out. They couldn't find anything to tie to it. So she then like fabricated evidence and then was like, oh, I found this. And it got up to the point where she literally admitted being directly involved in the murder with this guy. So she ended up getting both of them sent to prison for killing this person, and they weren't even involved. She was just trying to get away, find a way to get away from this guy by having him take the fall for this murder, and they both ended up doing time in prison for something that Keith Jesperson was responsible for. I had no idea that there was that little twist to that story, but what's interesting, considering it hasn't been till now, 2022, that this victim has finally been identified, was Keith Jesperson took credit for this murder back in 2006. and was convicted of it in 2007, you know, just added on to the other women that he's killed. So more than 15 years ago, he'd already taken credit for this crime. But the issue was, and I know this was the case with more than one woman, was, you know, like a lot of killers, you know, a lot of the women he picked up would be like victims of opportunity. If he could, you know, create a situation where it would be just him and another person and he knows he can do what he wants, then that he doesn't need to know who these people are. So there was more than one victim that he didn't know their names. So when he took credit for this crime, like he said, he didn't remember her name, but he admitted, you know, he picked up this woman and brutally killed her and left her on the side of the road along Highway 152, right where this victim was found. They were obviously the same individual. So he took credit for a murder wherein the victim is more than 15 years later before she was finally identified. And this is, you know, it's amazing where DNA is going these days, and the fact that they can create profiles that establish relatives of a certain someone, and they can use that to narrow down who a certain individual is. And they've been using that a lot to catch serial killers. Obviously, the Golden State Killer was one of the first big cases, but a lot of these things that have sat here unsolved for decades are now suddenly getting solved because of the capabilities that now exist out there. So thanks to that work, and according to this article I have up, it says, I'm quoting this piece that was posted on Pamplin Media, which is local. With help from the Jane Doe project, the SCSO was able to identify Skiple and then confirm that she was the latest identified victim of Keith Jesperson, the happy-faced killer. And it's interesting because according to what I've seen about this, Patricia Skiple lived in the Colton area, which is an unincorporated little community, and it's just east of Molalla, Oregon, which is a little south from where I live in the general Portland metropolitan area. But because Colton is right next to Molalla, some articles have said that Skiple had lived in Molalla, and in all likelihood she would have had a Molalla address at the time. And reportedly, she just had an argument with her husband and walked out. So I don't know. That's all I saw. So I don't want to speculate too much. There's not really any reason to. We know now who the victim is, and we know who was responsible. But so I don't know if she got into a car and drove away, or if she just went out and started walking on the streets, you know, just to try to cool off or get away from the situation. But whatever the circumstances, it seems somewhere along the line she stumbled onto Jesperson, or more than likely he stumbled onto her. And it's interesting because you think, how did this woman, you know, she leaves her home just south of this area just south of the Portland area, and she ends up way down in California, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from home. But Jesperson worked as a truck driver, so that could, you know, probably explain the vast distances between where this woman is last seen alive and where she's found dead. So odds are he picked her up. You know, like most serial, I know a lot of his victims were often described as either sex workers or transients. You know, he targeted victims of opportunity, victims who would probably willingly get into his vehicle with him. And it seems that Patricia Skiple is a little bit of a deviation from that. I found nothing in this information that would suggest she was in sex work, or she obviously had a home, so she wasn't transient. So she may have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, is what it seems like, when Jesperson stumbled along, and he probably drove her a lengthy distance. I would think, you know, once he starts driving her away from home, she probably would have realized the danger she was in and probably would have tried to fight to get away. So I wonder if she was killed, or at least potentially knocked unconscious by whatever circumstances not long after Jesperson picked her up. So either she would have been out for a long time during that travel, or he would have killed her relatively quickly and then drove her a long distance to ditch the body somewhere where nobody would know who she was. Again, who knows? Only Jesperson knows, and odds are he probably doesn't remember a lot of the details anyway, but that would probably explain why she ended up so far from home. And it seemed like one of these cases, you just find a random body alongside the road. Nobody knows her locally. This seemed like a case that was going to sit there and get cold and stay cold for a really long time. And it would have probably had Jesperson not taken credit for it. And had he not taken credit for it, and she was still identified by now, I mean, would we really even know? I mean, obviously the time in which she disappeared was while Jesperson was going around, and she was living just south of the Portland area where Jesperson was known to peruse and try to get his victims. I'm sure he would have come up as a potential suspect. But yeah, so this is another instance of a case of, it's been cold for several decades, involving a Jane Doe case out of Oregon, where it never brings them back. And when a victim is unidentified, their family doesn't know where they are. They don't know if they're living or dead. As the years go by, it starts to feel more and more likely that they are deceased at that point, but you never know until you know. So just about anybody wants to keep up a little bit of hope until they know for certain that maybe their missing loved one is alive somewhere. So in situations like this, where someone who's been missing for a long time is finally identified as someone who is unfortunately deceased in this case, and it never brings you what you wish in terms of them by some chance being alive, but it at least answers some questions and can take away some of that nagging sensation of not knowing what happened. Even though what happened in this case with this woman was a terrible experience that nobody should have to experience. But I know, for me, if I was somebody in this situation with a loved one who disappeared a long time ago, that would really eat at me, that element of just not knowing what happened and wanting to know so badly what happened, whether it means finding someone alive or discovering they died 30 years ago. I would really want to know what happened, regardless of the fact that that doesn't bring a loved one back to life for you. So in this vein, for this victim, at least 2022 has brought us the identity of a woman who vanished after walking away from her home all these many years ago. And she had family, she had children. That's not to say that somebody who's single or someone who's just living isolated from the world, that suffering a similar fate on their part would be any less of a tragedy. But just still, this was a wife, this was a mother, this was a loved one. In one of the articles I read, they spoke to, I believe, a sister of hers, people that all these many years later have held out hope that something would happen in this case. And now something finally has. And Keith Jesperson, according to some resources I've seen, has said he's killed up to like 185 people. That sounds kind of like Henry Lee Lucas numbers. I don't really know if I believe that, but I certainly think if he was prowling around like this for 5 or so years, and he was a truck driver, which means he was visiting a lot of different places, I'm sure there's a lot of other victims out there that he's killed that are Jane Does that have never been identified, that hopefully, like in this case, they will finally someday also be identified and get their name back. So I just wanted to bring that to you guys in this video, because I try to cover things like this when they happen, when these mysteries are finally solved and they've been laying there dormant for so long. And a lot of them I knew about. I didn't know about this case, but a lot of these other ones that have recently been resolved, the skull on Mount Hood that was found back in the 80s, the infant baby found in Southern Oregon, like those were instances I knew about even before they were resolved. And so I always want to cover these when they hit pretty close to home like this. And the Molalla Colton area, I've shot some video for movies I've done out in that area. I've been out there numerous times, so it's when you can personally put yourself in the location where this certain someone was at one time just living their life, is it adds a little element of, I don't know, it kind of gives you goosebumps or makes the hair on your neck stand up a little bit, knowing you've been where something tied to these types of events, the actions of a serial killer. It can be unnerving to a degree, but unfortunately horrible things like this can happen anywhere. So all that said, again, at least Patricia Skiple has a name to go with, or her recovered body has a name to go with it, and we know what happened with her. So that's it. I just wanted to address that story, as I've just now found it out almost a month later. So yeah, thank you so much for stopping by. Remember, as always, like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon if you want to help me out there. A link to that is in the description with the video, as well as links to my other pieces of social media. And all that said, thank you for stopping by. This has been Steve the Amateur Historian.